I can't stop my hair from doing the emo thing today, and I don't hate it. This is such an intimidatingly enormous sci-fi epic that I don't even know where to begin. Infinity Gate is the new sci-fi novel by M.R. Carey, who has written many incredible comic books for Marvel and DC, including one of my favourite comics, The Unwritten, and then he wrote the novel The Girl with All the Gifts, which has sold over 1 million copies, was turned into a film that I haven't seen, and I read The Girl with All the Gifts recently, and it was a fantastic piece of post-apocalyptic fiction. And now he's written an incredible, multiversal science fiction epic, and this is also the first in a duology. Infinity Gate drew me in a way that few books are able to do. I tore through the last 150-ish pages of this the other day, and after I put it down and got on with the rest of my day, I felt confused about what was real. like when you wake up from a dream and you go, oh, did any of that happen? Is that really my job? Is that where I live? I don't live there. I've never even been there. Where am I? Who am I? You might have had that feeling when you wake up from a dream. I had that when I woke up from this, realizing that we don't actually know if there's a multiverse. We certainly don't have access to it. But I was genuinely confused about what was real because I was so drawn into this novel. Afterwards, I just couldn't remember where this novel ended and life began. Now that's a compliment. But it's a novel that covers so much. It's 500 pages long, and so trying to figure out what to give away and what might be considered a spoiler might be a little bit tough, so I'm going to do my best as I always do. Infinity Gate begins in our future. It's not clear when in our future. I'm going to assume a few decades from now, where climate change and capitalism have ravaged the planet to the point of human extinction. There really is no hope left. Our protagonist is a scientist working out of a lab in Lagos, Nigeria. Her name is Hadiz Tambawal, and while working alongside an AI that her colleague created, she manages to accidentally stumble across the ability to travel between dimensions. And so she runs some tests. She transfers a few things from A to B, a drone, and then eventually herself, because she's all that's left. The world is falling apart around her, and she pretty much has to step, that's what it ends up being called, into a parallel world in order to survive. Hadiz's Earth, our Earth, is at the end. It's over. And so she steps away. As soon as she does that, though, her presence is monitored by a man called Vemet. Vemet works as a watchmaster for something called the Pandominion. As the blurb says, the Pandominion is a political and trading alliance of 1 million worlds. As it turns out, the multiverse is made up of an infinite number of Earths, or at least as close to infinite that it doesn't really matter. And our Earth is something called a sinkhole, an Earth that never learned to step before humanity reached extinction. And because there's an infinite number, different Earths manage to learn step technology or step abilities at different times. And the Pandominion is made up of 1 million different Earths that all manage to step and discover each other. Generally, when an Earth learns to step, it goes to war with its nearest neighbors until it realizes that war is kind of pointless, because when you step, you then have access to a world that has resources or technology or knowledge that yours doesn't, and so the best thing to do is trade, not fight. And so we have an enormous alliance of worlds, but they are all Earth. But our Earth was a sinkhole, an Earth that never learned to do that. Hadiz is stepping and exploring, and she is an anomaly on the scanners of this council, and so she grabs their attention. Okay, the book is actually really heavy, so I've swapped it out for a cup of coffee. We follow Hadiz for a little bit longer. She spends some time in a neighbouring world where she befriends a guy called Essien, a local Lagos guy who lives in a world that is almost identical to ours, barring a few differences, and Carey very smartly slips in a few differences to show us that this is a world almost identical to ours, but not quite. For example, in this second world, New York is still called New Amsterdam. Arnold Schwarzenegger has a different first name. Hadiz befriends this guy. They form a casual sexual relationship, and she reveals to him that she's actually from a different world, a world that destroyed itself. And Essien decides to try to steal her technology, sell it, and make a lot of money. And so the two of them step to a world that has no humans, a perfect, beautiful place full of strange animals where they can sit on a beach and have a picnic. And he moves to betray her. But she sees right through him and says, "Did you not know that I knew exactly what you were doing the whole time?" And just at that moment, Vemet, the man from earlier who works for the Council of the Pandemonium, appears with two soldiers. They have stepped into this space, and they are taking Hades and Essian prisoner. They take them to another Earth, where they interrogate them. I won't tell you what happens to Hades, but I will say that Essian becomes a soldier. He is recruited into the ranks of a very dangerous and powerful military group of super soldiers. And this is really narratively useful, because he's from a sinkhole planet, he gets nicknamed Sinkhole, and through his eyes we get to learn more about the Pandemonium. He's a great point of view character. But Infinity Gate is such a large novel that we don't follow these characters all the way through. Perspectives change. And actually, for most of the second half of the novel, we follow the perspective of a rabbit girl. Having an infinite number of parallel Earths, where slightly different things have happened on all of them, means that Carey gets to flex his imagination muscles. The dominant, most intelligent species on each given world isn't always descended from apes. They might be descended from something else. And so on a lot of these worlds, they are different creatures. And so we follow an anthropomorphized rabbit girl for the second half of the novel. And Vemet, the guy I mentioned before, is actually descended from a mole or something, some burrowing creature. They all speak a unified language called Grunt, and we learn more and more fun and interesting stuff about these different Earths and the fact that each one calls its planet a different thing. The discovery of these different worlds continues on all throughout the novel. But, as the blurb gives away, there is an overarching threat, which I will talk about since the blurb does. You see, the Pandemonium operates across 1 million worlds. But that's not all of them. There's also a lot of sinkhole worlds. There are an infinite number of worlds where no intelligent life formed. There's one world we learn about called Mother Mass, which is a world where single-celled organisms never actually evolved into more complex things and instead smushed together into one giant jelly-like organism that wraps around the entire planet into one huge brain. There is one world out there where the entire planet is one massive organism that operates as a brain that telepathically communicates with anyone who tries to step into it, immediately telling them, "Fuck off, we don't want you here, get off our world." And that world is called Mother Mass. Brilliant. There's also a series of worlds in the tens of thousands called Scour worlds. Worlds where 500 years ago, all life was wiped out suddenly. At the exact same time, as far as we can tell, something came along 500 years ago and wiped out all life on tens of thousands of different worlds. That thing, whatever it was, must have been able to step, and it stepped through all these worlds, wiping them all out and scouring them, and they are called the Scour. But the main threat comes across just as Hades has learned to step and we are following her journey. That threat is a machine opposition to the Pandemonium. The Pandemonium is a political and trading alliance amongst living things, the most intelligent creatures on each given world. But it turns out that there's a machine version of the Pandemonium, most closely resembling the Borg from Star Trek, I guess. There is a series of worlds, possibly totaling in the thousands, hundreds of thousands, where all life is mechanical. They communicate with each other in different ways, their lives serve a different purpose, they are a hive mind of machines. And when members of the Pandemonium are stepping and they discover this machine world, they don't know what to do, and so they act in a hostile way. But the machines cannot grasp what the Pandemonium is, and they don't know how to retaliate because they're not used to this. What you have is two worlds, effectively, two societies, two civilizations, that operate entirely differently, mechanically and biologically. And because they think differently and operate differently, they don't know how to interact with each other. And this is the spark that starts a possible war. And we know from the prologue that Hades is going to play a major role in this, a random scientist from a sinkhole world, who only begins as our protagonist before so much more happens. This is a colossal story. And as I've already said, It's the first of a duology, and I'm genuinely annoyed I can't read the second one right now. The thing is, it's a very obvious point to make that multiverses are trendy right now, especially thanks to the MCU. But M.R. Carey has done something wholly unique here. When I was reading it, I was reminded several times of Terry Pratchett and Stephen Baxter's The Long Earth series. I think there are 4 books in that series, and I read the first 2 before I got bored because it was ultimately pretty boring. This is how you do it. Infinity Gate is how you do multiversal travel, discovery, warfare, and philosophy. In true M.R. Carey fashion, he does as much as he can with his own imagination to flesh out the concepts and realities of this multiversal world. Different paths of evolution, different things that could have happened, might happen, will happen to different worlds. And how exactly a unified political state amongst all of these worlds might actually work, or not work. Now, the book is 500 pages long, and I did say that it is incredibly magnetic and absorbing, and when I finished it, I wasn't sure what was real anymore. But there's also a negative to that, which is a lot of things get drawn out. There are quite a few action sequences. There are chases and situations where you really worry about the safety of your protagonist, but unfortunately, those sequences, and there are probably 3 of them, are drawn out to a painful degree. Chapters upon chapters go by, 20, 30, 40 pages go by, and you're still in a chase sequence, and you just think, this all could have been shrunk down to 10 pages. The book honestly could have been about 50 pages shorter if you'd shrunk down all of these kind of chase sequences. They didn't need to be so long. We're not watching an action movie. They could have been summed up a little bit more and nothing would have been lost, even in the tension. So that's one real criticism I have. And the other criticism I have is in the first 50 pages or so, where the book is trying to find its tonal feet. Because this is a piece of hard sci-fi that explores potentially real kinds of science, or at least sciences that feel as though they could be real to laymen like myself. It's trying to figure out how much of a drama it wants to be, how hard sci-fi it wants to go, how much comedy it's going to inject. After the first 50-ish pages, it's like Carey finds enough confidence to let all of the scientific jargon go and push forward with the fun sci-fi theories and journeys and interactions. But just take this moment from page 52. This is when Hadiz is running tests, and she's doing so with the help of her AI companion, Rupshi. Rupshi was working at full strength, plotting all those thousands of variables on a vast polydimensional grid. The graph in its raw form was too complex to be represented in any visible medium. It existed nowhere except in the system's calculations. Hadiz only saw it in a vastly oversimplified 2D projection, but she was enthralled to see that it had a shape. As Rupshi had predicted, the shape was the Baroque multifoliate extravaganza of a quaternion fractal, a Mandelbrot set, or one of its close cousins. What? What did any of that mean? I don't know. Someone knows. Scientists probably know. I don't even know what type of scientist. An engineer? A physicist? A mathematician? I don't know, but it's not me. And then that goes away. That was on page 52. By page 70, that's all gone. And we just move on with the theory and the fun fiction of it all. But it feels as though Carey needed to put some of that in to make us believe that all of this could be possible, but I didn't need that. It's science fiction, not science. Ultimately, it doesn't bother me. I just honestly found it funny. I read that passage like 3 times and laughed, because I didn't know what else to do with it. Those are the only 2 criticisms I have. Everything else in this book is just perfection. Science fiction perfection. And since I mentioned the machine version of the Pandemonium, I should take this moment to point out that it goes to some really fun theoretical and philosophical debates surrounding intelligence and purpose and the meaning of life. Theoretically, if you had a machine society that functioned entirely differently to a human society but still worked, what would that look like? And what would that mean for purpose? They interact in a different way, and you start to wonder what their lives mean and how valuable their lives are, and the rights and liberties of a society like that, where rights and liberties are not a thing it's really interesting to think about as the book goes on. And then there's also the fact that because not all of the living creatures that make up the Pandemonium are human, the word human isn't used very often in the book. In fact, every individual person is not a human being, but a self. And I really enjoyed that. The book plays around with things like that an awful lot, including pronouns, where there are certain species that don't use pronouns, sex, and gender in the same ways. Absolutely brilliant. Ultimately, there's so much here for me to cover that I just can't. But that's why you read it. That's why you need to go and read Infinity Gate now. If you love the concept of multiverses, I honestly think that this book does it better than anything I've seen. Certainly better than the Long Earth series, better than I've seen in comic books and science fiction shows and other novels. This is a book that both asks and answers a lot of questions when it comes to the concept of multiversality and how it would work or can't work and what we might come up against. Why the Pandemonium exists in the first place, how it came to be, and what its future might be. Artificial intelligence, machines versus bio-living things. There's so much in here to explore. And the fact that we move from protagonist to protagonist because there's just so much time and space that can be explored. It's enormous. And you'll enjoy every moment of it, except for those where things could have just been shortened and tightened up a little bit. Infinity Gate is an amazing science fiction novel. Absolutely wonderful. So if you like the sound of this, check the book out, support me on Patreon, and subscribe for books.